I've got Cesare Salemi here with me in the flesh. He's just flown back from California with me last night, and really excited. And then we've got Graison Gill, who's going to be joining us in just a couple of minutes. I got a message from him that he was putting a loaf in the oven, and of course he is. So today, I've just come back from a big trade show in Las Vegas with My Forno, and Cesare is the co-founder of My Forno. But while we were there, before the kind of the madness of the public event opened up, we went upstairs and sat in on a workshop from Graison, and it was just a magical moment for me. That was my first time meeting Graison, but he's someone who I've looked up to for years and years now, and for Cesare, him and Graison go way back, and Cesare was the MC for the kind of the Woodstock of grain conferences back in Australia in 2019, and it was at John's place, John Reed from Redbeard, and Cesare is wearing.
This is John's shirt. It was white sliced death, and John was a phenomenal man that really showed his ethic through his bread, and was one of the trailblazers of sourdough in Australia. Really a country that just does white bread in tins. And John would have a single arm mixer, a big beast of a wood oven, no refrigeration, and he was a really great man. And we got to have that beautiful conference, and we actually invited Graison to speak at that conference, and it was a really powerful thing. And ironically, that was in, I think it was October 2019. Well, then in January the following year, COVID started. And so, and so many bakeries globally spawned from that, especially in Australia, like hundreds have. And it's just basically, this, how do we make the loaf of bread represent, life on every level, and in every form of expression. And GrAINZ is, even GrAINZ, it's on Instagram. We aren't really an official company of any form. We're just basically a bunch of collective bakers that all love each other and love the craft, and we just use this thing. Actually, Ian Lowe, I think I just want to honor the people that Emily Sarkeld, Ian Lowe, Michael James, great friends, all and a bunch of others, all just basically got together. I think it was 2016, and said, "Hey, we want to get the bakers with the millers, with the maltsters, with the farmers, and start dialoguing together and sharing notes." And the pinnacle really was at John Reed's grain gathering. We had Dr. Stephen Jones from the Washington State Bread Lab come, Kimberly Bell from UK Grain Lab, Graison, a whole bunch of other magnificent people. And it's really important. Bread's not just bread. Dr. Steve talks about it. Bread's broken. Let's fix it. And I myself, I'm a third generation baker. We grew up making 10,000 pounds of bread a day, but it was white flour. And I remember I attended, me, John, Michael James, James Partington from Staple Bread, Kimberly, we met over there in Kimberly Bell. We went to the grain gathering in Washington State Bread Lab, and it just blew our mind, like how important the bread we create really is. And if as the world's created a high refined white flour bread, no fermentation, sickness has followed. And it's sort of the big companies aren't really correcting that. That's like the whole thing with the sourdough geeks. you don't understand how important you are. You know, the ethic that you have, and that you start making bread right for you, for your family, for your friends, for your community. You know, I just, it's a real honor to be actually, sorry, it's a real honor to be able to share this platform with you, James. And thank you so much for asking me.
Thank
because
you.
I believe a baker, a passionate food, is not just a baker, it's a passionate food revolutionist. And, you know, I just love that, you know, this group that's been fostered by James and whatnot, and what you all stand for. It's really important.
And for me, you know, and I'll introduce Graison in a minute. You know, I came to sourdough 12 or 13 years ago, and I guess what I'll call the second wave of sourdough. Graison has been making bread with freshly milled whole grain since before it was cool to do so. You know, for I think, you know, 12 years in New Orleans, he founded Bellegarde Bakery, which was doing, you know, New Orleans is really well known for French bread, but it's not really French bread. It's, you know, and here was someone who was, you know, going against the grain, if you will, and you know, was and I think at the height of it doing 10,000 loaves a week or something like that, just massive amount of bread. And then, you know, went and co-founded Alma Mill and Bakery in London, and now is back here. He's actually going back to school, and is just started his MFA. And but you know, I came to this world 12 or 13 years ago, and began making the kind of bread that I wanted to make. And when I opened my bakery, I was connected by a cottage baker in Louisville, Kentucky. And I'm going to give her a shout out here, Noelle Deeb of L Bread Shop, and she has a couple of Roughco ovens in her house, and eventually, you know, purchased a 60-quart spiral mixer. But for years she was mixing everything by hand, and it's just an extension of her home in Louisville. And I met her through Instagram, just looking for you know, like-minded bakers when we had moved to Louisville. And it was Noelle who connected me with Janie's Mill, and she had been getting flour direct from them. They're about an hour south of Chicago in Ashcombe, Illinois. And for the entire time that my bakery was open, we were sourcing all of our whole grains and our stone ground flours direct from the farm. And it was just to be a part of a food system that was so small was such an honor and such a beautiful thing for me. We made a loaf of bread called the Farmhouse sourdough loaf at the Grain Right, and it was 100% stone milled grain that was grown by Harold, milled by Jill, and baked by me. So that there was three stops in the food chain from field to loaf. And you know, the founding of Sourdough Geeks, that, you know, that happened, you know, before I opened my bakery. But everything was about you know, connecting like minds when it comes to baking, and being able to connect bakers with farmers and millers, and just, you know, to collectively skill up. And I can say without a shadow of a doubt that I am the baker that I am today in large part due to Sourdough Geeks, to having founded a community, not with any plans or designs or ideas, but just as a safe space for us to to talk bread together and bread and life, I guess. But built around kindness, understanding, and mutual support. And that community, this community has given me so much, you know, arguably more than I've put into it as well. And I've put in a lot. And so, having been out to Vegas and listened to Graison talk, and I've never met him, but you know, as soon as he opened his mouth, just everything that man said just completely resonated to my core. And I knew then that I wanted to share that experience.
Just to reiterate what James is saying, I'm a career baker. I'm a third generation baker. I was doing it before, I guess it was cool. For me, bread wasn't cool. We had a massive factory in our backyard. We used to live on the property, and every spare second that we were awake, I was baking bread, you know, from 6. But the thing that we learned in that bakery is, you know, we were a white flour bakery, first generation Italian bakery in Australia, supplying all the immigrants that came to Australia, was the value of bread. You know, Dad's like, senza pane non mangia. This is an Italian saying, which basically means without bread, we can't eat. You sit down, you work hard. First thing you grab, you know, mama's put the pasta down, you know, the bread's the spoon as you eat. And but as I matured through my baking process and my baking career, I started to understand how broken. I didn't look beyond the bag of flour. Right? Bakery started with the bag of flour. You rip it open, that's it. You know, you put whatever else you did. And when you start to understand what actually goes in behind the scenes on flour, that's crazy. When you walk a wheat field and you crack the grain and you eat it on the field, and then you taste it milled, and then you ferment it and make it broken, you understand flavor starts in the ground, right? And so, you know, to me, bread is it's a discipline of cause and effect. You know, it's a real discipline of cause and effect. How do you want the bread to bubble? Do you want it to be airy? Do you want it to be light? Do you want it to be dense? As you start to understand, in the beginning, as you start to understand what sourdough is, it's overwhelming. But once you start to get the rhythms of it, you can start to manipulate the feedings to create the kind of product that you want. And it's all about cause and effect. And after making millions of loaves, I thought, well, I want to affect the cause. And that is, I want to heal the broken bread system. And, you know, pioneers like Graison, like John Reed, like a lot of our beautiful friends, you know, bread is broken, but the thing is, we can fix it. And, you know, you're fixing it one loaf at a time. As you have been drawn to this, the universe has brought you into this introduction to bread. And as you've gone into this beautiful relationship with bread, you know, it's like, as you learn more and more, you can actually fix it, you know, and by having direct relationships with the farmers, fermenting it properly, adding, look, some will say it's all got to be whole grain. I used to be a zealot like that. I used to have a bakery called Dust, and we used to fresh mill hot into the bowl, like at 50 degrees, and start fermentation straight away, so there was no oxidization. But the reality is that the prebiotic, like the bran is a prebiotic, it needs to feed your stomach. If you got 5%, 10% in there, 20% in there, it's great. But you know, and you know, the bread that you create, it's healing. It's not only healing the food system, it's healing your stomach. Those beautiful loaves that you create, as you give it to your clients, as you give it to your friends, you're getting that joy interaction. It's so important, you know, like a rich man, poor man, a fresh, hot sourdough, it's as good as you're going to get. You know, some nice butter, a bit of olive oil, you know what I'm saying? Like some freshly cut sourdough. And you guys are facilitating one loaf at a time. You know, that I call it the re-love-lution, because it's not a revolution. We don't need another revolution. We need more love. And, you know, as you create, think about the process of sourdough. It's really a measure of care. You're putting more care. Your consciousness is awoken to the process. It's love, you know, and so it's a re-love-lution. And that's the solution.
And Graison is in here. I didn't see him come in. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Graison, and yeah, I'm really looking forward to listening. I'm normally the one
Me
talking,
too.
but I'm looking forward to listening. So Graison, have at it.
Thank you, James, and thank you, Ches, and thanks for everyone taking time out of your Saturday morning to be a part of this great community. I just met James, like he said, for the first time a week ago at the big convention in Vegas. And I've known Cesare for a good 10 years or so now. And like I think most of you know, the sourdough, baking community is so intimate because we're all obsessed. I think we're all obsessed with something that's bigger than us, and the ability to connect with other people that share that obsession is really powerful. It's really nurturing and it's really authentic. And I'm 38 and I've been baking since I was 21. And despite COVID or hurricanes in Louisiana or all sorts of other personal and professional things that have happened, I've never once thought twice about how much I love baking and how obsessed I am with it every single day. And I've done a lot of things in my life in terms of work and creativity and exploration, but I think like a lot of you feel, there's nothing as authentic and as nourishing as making and sharing a loaf of bread. So despite all the things that go on in our lives or in the world or with our families, bread has always been a compass for me to return to and to understand which way I need to go if I'm not sure which way it is that I need to go. And I've never found anything that's so authentic and so beautiful and so consistent in my life and in the lives of other people as well too. And like James mentioned earlier, I started a bakery in New Orleans in 2009. I moved there from New York City on a Greyhound bus and showed up to an apartment I was sharing with about 5 people. And for whatever reason, I started baking. I got bit by the sourdough bug, and was baking in my apartment, checking out books from the library like Nancy Silverton and James Beard and Tassajara and Peter Reinhardt and all these types of things. There was no Instagram or YouTube videos or tutorials. So it was really just looking at a book, mixing, making an incredible mess, and saying a few prayers that as it retarded overnight, that it would be somewhat edible the next day. And I took copious notes just to make sure that I was kind of integrating what I was learning into what I was doing next. But maybe like some of you, I would always up the ante like a gambler and be like, I'll put 5% more water in there, or I could push the fermentation, or I'm so scared I'm going to put it in early and it's going to be a block of ice the next day. But even though it was frustrating in the moment, I think that beauty, that kind of communication between my hands and my heart and the dough is something, again, it really just brings me back day in and day out to baking or talking about baking and being able to touch the bread, because I think that I've spent a lot of time thinking that I'm the one that's shaping the bread and it's really the bread that's shaping me. And I just love that. I love that relationship because it is so authentic and it is so tactile. It's something that we touch in a way that we're touched back. As much as we touch it, as much as we give to it, it gives the same amount in return. And I was baking for about a year or two in my apartment in New Orleans, and I started selling to neighbors. I probably need to make restitution to those neighbors because the shit that they bought from me, they probably just saw this like 21-year-old kid that was desperate to, make bread, and the things that they paid $5 for, I probably have a few $1,000s I need to pay back to people that bought those first loaves. But I eventually kind of found myself at a crossroads where I was renting a little bit of space in a commercial kitchen with a bunch of different people. And I was doing farmers markets and some cafes and stuff. But besides the books I was getting at the library, I didn't know or have any mentors. Again, there was no Instagram or no Facebook groups about resources for recipes and stuff like that. So I decided to go to SFBI, the San Francisco Baking Institute. And back then they had a 6-month professional program. So we did everything from wedding cakes to croissants to ciabatta and banana bread muffins and stuff like that. And I stayed in California for about a year and a half after graduating from that program. And then I went back to Louisiana. I borrowed a little bit of money from the government, from the SBA. I bought a bunch of really cheap, really awful, really broken equipment. And I started a bakery in 2011 in New Orleans. And then, like James was saying, by the month before COVID, the bakery had grown to staff of about 25. We were doing about 10,000 loaves of bread a week by hand, and we were milling about 5,000 pounds of flour per week for ourselves and for local customers and other bakeries as well too. So kind of like that, sourdough starter. It started a few teaspoons, a few grams, and I just kept feeding it with the desire to do more, not so much more money and more volume, but just the desire to share my belief and my passion for organic whole grain sourdough bread. And it was difficult in a place like Louisiana in 2012, 2013, 2011. I can't tell you how many times I went to bring bread to chefs and they would literally just throw it in the trash can in front of my face because they just thought that it was too different, too weird. I have a list of all the different things that people would tell me, that it was obviously too dark, it was too expensive, it was too sour, it was too weird. But my favorite one is that it was too flavorful. So to have a chef tell me that an ingredient in his or her kitchen is too flavorful was my favorite thing, because we've neglected flavor in bread for going on 100 years now. We just think that bread and pizza and pasta are like this edible napkin that we can dump a bunch of shit on top of, whether that's sugar, butter, salt, fat, pizza sauce, mozzarella, whatever it is. We're masking the main ingredient in our food, which is flour in our bread. And we can pay attention to the water, that does something to the bread. We can pay attention to the salt, does a little bit, but really, if we're not paying attention to our main ingredient, which is flour, in a way, we're kind of like, in my opinion, committing a bit of perjury to the craft, because I can't think of a painter that doesn't think about color. I can't think about a musician that doesn't think about their instrument. And I can't think of an architect that doesn't think about building materials. And yet here we are as bakers, just ripping open a bag of anemic, dead white flour from King Arthur that we just yank off the shelf. And for me, food should be living, it should be alive, it should be fresh, it should be perishable, it should go bad. Just like a tomato, just like milk, just like cheese, just like anything else that we eat, no matter what culture we come from, food should have a shelf life. And we should be, for me, I want to be using flour that has a point of ripeness, not just ripeness in terms of health and nutrition, but also flavor and aroma and texture and integrity as well too. So the funny thing that kind of happened at SFBI, like I said, I don't know if anyone has their textbook. It's that huge black textbook that Michelle Suas wrote. It's pretty much, I'd say, the Bible in English of any sort of baking that anybody wants to do. It's 700-800 pages, Advanced Bread and Pastry by Michelle Suas, and that was our textbook at school. And it's the Bible. It's a great book. But I began to notice something at SFBI when I was there, and especially when I left. But I began to notice that we were talking about certain ingredients having identity, like having terroir. So we would talk about chocolate and the difference with different chocolate. We talk about fat, difference in fat. We would talk about sugars, different types of sugars, talk about different milks, talk about all these different ingredients that had different identities, different backgrounds, different places that they came from. But the main ingredient that we were working with was flour. So whether we were making a wedding cake or whether we were making a baguette, in our recipe book, all it said was flour. Maybe it said cake flour, maybe it said AP flour, but every single time we would talk about an ingredient that had identity or terroir or had some story behind it, we weren't doing that with flour. It was the same dead, just white flour across the board. And I began to wonder, why are we paying attention to sugar, chocolate, fat, dairy, salt, all these different ingredients, and we're not paying attention to our main ingredient, which is flour? And that kind of put me on a rabbit hole after I had opened the bakery in New Orleans to understand where flour came from. And as everybody here knows, that's a pretty huge question, especially if you live in the US with 330 million people. It's pretty difficult to understand where a single ingredient comes from. And to put it into perspective, 1 in 5 calories throughout the entire world comes from wheat. It's the most grown crop on the planet. So for a 23-year-old kid in New Orleans to ask the question of himself, where does flour come from? It was pretty much a life-changing decision, to really understand where it comes from, and then most importantly, how I can make it better. And that put me on the journey of deciding that nobody was making the flour that I wanted to work with. So I decided to make my own flour. And I'm not going to spend time talking about the horror stories of spilling 2,000 pounds of wheat in the middle of the street in New Orleans, or mills that broke, or problems with farmers. But it was a beautiful journey of learning how to make our most important ingredient. And it started really like a bit of a drug addiction, where I had a little tabletop mill from Pleasant Hill and I was cranking it. And then I got that stupid bicycle one and I was pedaling. And then I got a little bigger one from Meadows, and it just snowballed. It was kind of a gateway, the little one from Pleasant Hill, and it snowballed to the point that in 2014, 2015, I bought the first ever mill from Andrew at New American Stone Mills in Vermont. So the very first mill that he ever sold, I bought that. He's probably built about 300-400 by now, but I bought that very first one and brought it to New Orleans and started milling flour. And I only started using more and more and more flour as I began milling more and more, because I realized the texture, the aroma, the flavor, and the nutrition was unlike anything that I could find in a bag. And suddenly, talking about like painters or musicians, suddenly the ability to work with my own ingredient that I had so much intimacy and kind of understanding for, it was kind of like Dorothy going from black and white and going into Technicolor in The Wizard of Oz. I was kind of living in this black and white world, with just ripping open a bag of white flour from Central Milling or King Arthur or Karen Springs, or just name whoever. And if you put this stuff to your nose, if you put it on your lips, if you put it on the tip of your tongue, it kind of just sits there. It kind of sits like a car that's been forgotten in a parking lot. There's no interaction with your mouth. There's no interaction with the aroma. There's no interaction with the texture. But the minute that you taste whole grain, freshly milled flour, again, suddenly everything becomes three-dimensional. Everything kind of comes into living color. And it changed how I baked, because I was more or less a traditionally trained baker doing what I was told. And ever since I was a kid, I never really did what I was told. And I wasn't going to make any compromises when I became an adult. And everybody told me it was crazy to mill my own flour. Everybody said it was a waste of time, or it was a hassle, or it's too expensive. And again, 2013 in New Orleans, there was no Instagram or Facebook page about where do I find wheat berries in the South. So I had to call every single university from Texas to Florida to North Carolina to Arkansas and ask these people, where can I get wheat? I want to mill wheat. And that's a different story, but it was another journey, just like a journey of learning how to bake a perfect baguette or how to make a perfect sourdough country bread. It was a journey about learning how to source. It was a journey about learning how to mill. And it became a whole nother layer to the craft that I love, to be able to touch the granite and touch the grain, and not just to show up every day and mix a starter, retard the bread, and come back the next day and bake it. But all of a sudden I was responsible for finding growers and farmers that were as passionate and as invested as I was in what they did and who they are. And that's how I started sourcing the grain, because I feel like for me, it's always been really critical that my ingredient should match the methods that I'm putting into my baking. So I don't feel like I can come to the table with so much love and passion and intention and time that I'm investing in making my bread and just use a roller milled dead white flour from King Arthur. That ingredient does not match the method that I'm bringing to the table. So when I'm working with a whole grain flour, whether somebody else is milling that or I'm milling that myself, it's the ingredient matching the process. It's the ingredient matching the method. And that's where the meaning for me is created, when I'm drawing a line, a direct line between the ingredients, the sourcing, the people that are doing it, and the bread that's coming out of my oven. And whether you're a home baker or a micro baker, or you have a small retail bakery, culturally, we all love feeding people. We love sharing bread. We love making it. We love telling our stories. We love a smile on the face when we hand somebody a warm loaf of bread. But there came a time in my life about 10 years ago when I realized, a little bit longer than that, but when I realized, when I was still using a lot of white flour, that it's my duty as a baker and as somebody that feeds people in the community, that I need to feed people. But I also realized, when I learned more about the health kind of consequences of white flour, that my duty went beyond feeding people, and my duty became to nourish people more so than feeding people. And I think there's a big difference between those words. To feed somebody is to take care of them, but I think to nourish somebody is a more of a full circle, holistic intention that you're setting, not just for yourself and your body and your family, but for the earth and for your community and where you come from as well too. And I don't believe personally that we can nourish people with white flour. It's hurting the planet. It hurts our biomes. It hurts the soil. And at the end of the day, it's just not any fun to work with as a baker, because I can make the same batch of baguettes that Cesare can bake in Sydney. I can make those same batch of baguettes in Massachusetts as I can in Melbourne. I can make the same batch of baguettes in San Francisco as I can in Sydney if I'm just using plain white flour, because it's just homogenous. It's kind of like traveling and going to a McDonald's or Starbucks halfway across the world from your home. There's no identity, there's no difference, there's nothing that makes that flour any sort of thumbprint or fingerprint about who you are and where you come from. So for me, besides the nutrition and the ecological aspects and the craft of milling and all these things that I love, it's just not fun for me to work with white flour, because again, that's the same thing that everybody else can use. And I've taught all around the world, Scandinavia, Australia. I'm teaching in Japan in March, and everywhere I go, I don't bring recipes. I just bring an open mind, and I tell them to bring me the flour that they want to work with, the flour that they're most frustrated by, that they're most inspired by. And I take my recipes and my kind of blueprints for a baguette or a sourdough or whatever it is, and we use their local ingredients to make those breads with what they have available, because you can't have a cuisine if you don't have the ingredients. And I love tartine, and I love the aesthetic that Chad and Liz have built, and they've done remarkable things for the industry. But I think it's really, really, really sad that you can go to South Korea, you can go to New Zealand, you can go to Mexico City, or you could go to France, and everybody's just wanting to make tartine bread. I think it's really, really sad that we want to express ourselves in the same image, in the same way as somebody else is expressing themselves with their bread. And for me, the way to make bread personal is to make bread with the ingredients that are available to me locally, because otherwise I can't tell my story with somebody else's ingredients. I can't tell my story with the same white flour from central milling that everybody else can get. So that's really where things kind of came together for me, was understanding that from a nutritional standpoint, an ecological standpoint, but mostly from a creative craft standpoint, the ability to work with freshly milled whole grain flour, just it changed the game. Because suddenly, as opposed to working with a flour that was dead or lifeless or kind of tasteless, I was able to work with something that was alive, that had integrity and had its own character. And that's the kind of bread I want to make.